Hello and welcome to the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation's CISM Live series, where we connect with critical incident stress management subject matter experts live on YouTube. My name is Kelly Hall, and I'm the development coordinator for the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. My guest today is one of ICISF's co-founders, Dr. Jeffrey Mitchell, who for over 48 years developed a comprehensive, integrated, systematic, and multi-component crisis intervention program called the Critical Incident Stress Management. Dr. Mitchell is a clinical professor for emergency health services and at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County, Maryland. He has presented at conferences in 28 nations around the globe. Welcome, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly, for putting this together.
You're welcome. So today we're going to be discussing diffusings and critical incident stress debriefings and why you would recommend homogenous groups for those. So for our viewers, can you explain what a diffusing and a critical incident stress debriefing is in relation to critical incident stress management?
Okay, so a diffusing and a critical incident stress debriefing are actually part of a larger grouping of crisis intervention tactics, which is called critical incident stress management. And the diffusing is a group crisis intervention procedure that is used on the day of a tragedy, on the day of a traumatic event. And it's used as close as possible to the time in which the event has occurred. So as soon as it's reasonable to gather people together to finish with their job, situation is getting under control. As soon as it's reasonable, we try to bring them together and we provide a diffusing, which is it's a conversation, it's a guided conversation, but it only has 3 parts to it. So it's generally pretty short. It's about 20 minutes in time. Some people look at it as like that Band-Aid, that first step, if you would, to kind of control a painful experience. And then that is very frequently, but not always, the precursor to the critical incident stress debriefing. So the critical incident stress debriefing generally is not done until 2 or 3 days after the event. If the diffusing is done before the debriefing by, on the day, the first day, that's great, but sometimes that's not possible. So you end up doing the critical incident stress debriefing, usually 24 to 72 hours after the event. It's a bit more complicated group process. Instead of having the 3 stages like you would see in a diffusing, a critical incident stress debriefing has 7 phases and takes longer to do. It can be over an hour, and in some really bad cases, it might be up to as long as 2.5 or 3 hours, but it's normally in the range of about an hour, hour and a half to do a critical incident stress debriefing. And that's also a guided conversation, but people have had time to process the experience that they had, the traumatic event. They've, thought about it a bit. The emotions are down, so it's a little bit easier to talk about this a couple of days after it's happened. And so the critical incident stress debriefing has 7 parts to it. It's an organized, structured conversation. There are things that can go on before it, including individual support, and there are things that can go on afterwards, also individual support or education or working with spouses and families. So CISM is a very big, comprehensive program, and underneath that are a number of techniques, and the 2 that we're going to focus on during this session happens to be the diffusing, the critical incident stress debriefing, and we're going to talk about some of the criteria that's necessary before you would initiate either of those 2 procedures.
Now, from what I understand, we want to talk about both heterogeneous groups and homogeneous groups and how they apply to diffusings and critical incident stress debriefings. So how would you define a heterogeneous group?
A heterogeneous group is a very mixed group. They don't have the bonds of friendship. Sometimes they don't even know each other in a heterogeneous group. They don't have friendship. They don't have shared relationship. They don't have time together. They don't have shared history. I mean, when we don't have COVID and we can fly on an airplane, that's a very heterogeneous group. In fact, it's so heterogeneous it's given the name random, because there's nothing coordinated about it. People sign up, they get on the plane, and they don't very often don't know anybody who's on that plane. And that certainly has happened to me. Most of the flights I've ever taken, I didn't know anybody else on the plane. So that's a very heterogeneous group. And the more heterogeneous the group is, the more you can't use diffusing and debriefing. In fact, you shouldn't be using diffusing and debriefing for those groups. We use a different procedure called the crisis management briefing. Crisis management briefing is most appropriate for a mixed group of people, whereas the diffusing and the critical incident stress debriefing are really not the most appropriate interventions to use in those two groups.
Okay, so that kind of explains heterogeneous groups. So how do you define a homogeneous group, and what is the criteria for a group to be considered homogeneous, and why is it important to use homogeneous groups for both diffusings and debriefings?
Okay, a homogeneous group is a group that they know each other. They have shared relationship. Many times they're friends, not just coworkers. You know, at the very least of that, they're coworkers who have worked together. They respect each other. They know each other. And they are a good team together. They work together in a way that they can help each other get the job done. And that makes for a homogeneous group. The criteria for a homogeneous group are three main things. You have to have relationship among the group members to be a homogeneous group. So they know each other, they're friends, they often socialize together outside of the workplace. Even if they're not doing that, they certainly have that team effort within their group. So they have bonds between them. They do know each other. But another criteria is they've had a shared history. A shared history is where they go through the same types of events with each other. And of course, they've helped each other through those events operationally. And so the homogeneous group has the relationship. They have this shared history. Some of that history can be pretty long. I mean, some of the people have been working together for 5, 8, 10, 12, 15 years. So they often don't even have to communicate verbally. They can look at each other and know what the other person's thinking because they've had that much time together. So we have the time together. We had the bonding, okay, that they are at least good colleagues, if not good friends. And it takes, in addition to that shared history, it takes time. And the shared history is really important because they remember events from 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, and they learned lessons from those things as a group, as a team. They've learned these lessons from those. So that takes time to establish. You don't do that on first meeting. It really takes a lot of time. I'll give you an example of that. I teach a course at the University of Maryland on search and rescue. And they come in at the very last week of January, and they don't know each other. There's freshmen, there's sophomores, there's juniors, there's seniors. They've had no history whatsoever together. There's no shared history. You can't count on them to have a relationship. They really don't know each other, and they haven't had any time together. This is the first day of class. So in mid-April, we take them on a 3-day wilderness search and rescue experience. And by that time, you need them to be working together as a team. So it's a short period of time in a university class, but during that time, we assign them to committees. They have to get tasks done. They have to call each other. They have to communicate with each other. They have to write emails and text messages to each other. And if they don't make the plan, it doesn't come together. And then on that typical, when we don't have a COVID situation, on that typical trip, they are going to prepare meals together. And if they don't bring food, they don't get the food. So it's a problem. So they learn quickly that they have to work together. So by the time we get on that search and rescue trip, they've had February, March, and a couple of weeks in April to kind of, do that history sharing, at least in the class. They have become from somewhat at least good acquaintances, if not friends yet. So they have history, time, relationship. That's what makes a homogeneous group: history, time, relationship. Now, there is another thing that's very important when we look at what's the criteria for using a critical incident stress debriefing, or even a diffusing. The diffusing, of course, is the day one, and then the critical incident stress debriefing comes later. But there's another criteria that has to be added into the mix. In addition to the history, relationship, and time together, they have to have experienced most of the same elements of the same tragedy, the same traumatic event. If they're all different events, they work in very different places in the emergency services where they're operating, they don't have that same event. Just because somebody across town had an auto accident involving a child and it was very disturbing, the other folks on the other side of town weren't involved with that. So they don't have that experience of the same traumatic event. Now, they don't have to have the exact same aspects of the traumatic event. Somebody's seeing that event from this side of the mission, somebody's seeing it from over there. So their view of it may be a little different, but they were on the same event. So to round that out, you have to have history, time, relationship, and exposure to the same traumatic experience. Okay, not the minute pieces of it, but the overall traumatic experience. So that was for 4 criteria to do either a diffusing or debriefing: is relationship, time, history, and exposure to the same traumatic event. That's the criteria for putting people either into a diffusing or to a critical incident stress debriefing.
So, well, then I think you've answered my next question, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyway for our viewers. When would you use both of these types of groups within a CISM setting?
Okay, so let me just add in the crisis management briefing, which is a process designed very specifically to handle larger mixed groups. That would be the crisis management briefing. And a crisis management briefing was specifically designed to give groups of people information, and it is an information session only. So you're really giving people what they need to know to manage the situation they're involved with at that time. So the crisis management briefing plays its best role when the group just needs information, nothing else. It's no discussion. We do not ask them questions. They don't have to answer our questions. In fact, we prefer to just keep it on an information push. Just get that information out to them. And information is very important to people because it does reduce the anxiety and the distress they're going through. So information counts for a lot. So the crisis management briefing would be used for a heterogeneous group, that is a mixed group. Would not do diffusing. I would not do critical incident stress debriefing for them. Those things are off the table because you really need to have that homogenized group in order to make that group work effectively. So if I have a team or a group or a unit that has gone through the same traumatic event, even though they might have seen different parts of that event, if they've been on the same traumatic event and they have the other criteria, that is that homogeneity of the group, which means that they have history, relationship, and time, plus exposure to the event. If they have that, then we're more likely to have a success if we use the diffusing on first day, which is only 3 parts: introduction, exploration, information. And of course, those who are listening and they've had the training will know that, but those who are listening and they may not have had that training, would probably be a good idea for them to take the training, but that's sort of the basic explanation of it. So they have those criteria, the 4 criteria I've mentioned already, and they are struggling with some of the effects of this. That doesn't mean that they're falling apart and unable to do their job, but it's running through their minds. They're thinking about that tragedy. If it's been the ones that are bothersome to most people are children, so I'm just going to use that as an example. It's not the only ones, but those are pretty awful events for most emergency personnel. So even after the call is over, even after they return to quarters, they still have some of that lingering memory to stuff that may be causing them to have a little trouble sleeping, or it might cause them to be a little bit irritable or maybe a bit overprotective about their own children. So those are signals that we want to do something about that. Anything that causes sleep distress or causes people to change their emotional status, or they can't stop thinking about things, all those are indications you want to do something with it. So that's when the diffusing on day 1 would be very helpful to just alleviate some of that distress. And the distress that people are having is not a sign of weakness, and it is not a sign of mental instability. It just says that they're human beings. They got exposed to something that kind of hit them a little bit harder than other calls do. We don't do this on every single call. You only do it on a really stressful ones. So they're healthy, normal people who've had a healthy, normal response to a terribly abnormal event. So they go through that event. We can catch them on day 1, do diffusing, help reduce some of that distress. So the objective is to get them to return to job and function and family life, and not have this continue on to give them further and further difficulty. So that's why it's done. Now, some events are in need of a critical incident stress debriefing after you do a diffusing, okay?
Okay.
So if diffusing is day 1, the critical incident stress debriefing is usually 2 days or maybe 3 days after the event. The ideal time seems to be, from everything we've studied on this, that it's about 24 to 72 hours after the event. That's when the critical incident stress debriefing is done. Now that is frequently a session where things that they have thought about since the first day have now started to come up. And some of this stressful symptoms may be lingering on now a couple of days afterwards. This is the time to help clean up a good deal of that. It won't make everything go away, but it will certainly put a lot of it in perspective. And that's what we do in the critical incident stress debriefing. And that's a 7-phase process. It is done by a trained team of people, and it's usually 2-3 days post exposure to the traumatic incident, and that demands that heterogeneous group. Okay, so the heterogeneous group again is that group that has they know each other, there's relationship, there's time together, there's shared history, and they've had exposure to the traumatic event. So those are the 4 criteria that you look for to use either the diffusing or the critical incident stress debriefing. If I meet a group that has a lot of mix in it and they don't fulfill those criteria, then there are 2 things that can be done. One of those is provide them information in a crisis management briefing. And the second thing that can be done is to see them on an individual basis. Now, if you got 50 people, you're going to want to do the CMB, because you're not going to do 50 people individually, because that's a huge time commitment. So, but that's one of the follow-up things you can do in either the group cases for diffusing and debriefing, or the CMB. You can always do individual follow-up, okay? And so we can easily do that with the CMB, but our focus today, again, is on diffusing and debriefing and how we need to make sure we have the right criteria in the personnel who we're trying to help to do those two things, okay?
So what you're saying is that we do need, in a homogeneous group, we do need to have those 4 criteria that you've listed earlier when successfully performing either a diffusing or a critical incident stress or CIS debriefing.
Yeah,
now,
just debriefing.
Yeah, so what would happen if a CISM team or a group of individuals would use a heterogeneous group during a diffusing or CIS debriefing?
So this is if you're asking if you had a heterogeneous group. Did I get that question correctly?
Correct.
So
Yes.
if you're asking about having a heterogeneous group involved in a diffusing or a critical incident stress debriefing, I can pretty well predict that you're going to have either a group implosion or a group explosion. It's one of those two things, and neither is a good option. Okay.
Right.
What happens in the implosion? In the implosion, the group stops functioning. They shut down. The members do not want to, I mean, they're not really members of a group. The people who are attending in a heterogeneous group and they end up in a diffusing, they're not going to want to talk. They're not going to open up to other people. So they just go silent. Very hard to get anything out of a heterogeneous group that's a mixed group when you're trying to do a diffusing or critical incident stress debriefing. I'll use my own experience for explaining what happens when you have a group that's told they're going to do something that the group is really uncomfortable with. And that is when I was going through the preparing for my first baby. We went to one of those classes that they teach at the hospital, and they're good classes because they give you a lot of information about baby care and safety and things like that. And that's all great. And I paid a lot of attention to that. But one night, the nurse who was leading that group said, what we're going to do tonight is have everybody sit in a circle and we're going to discuss your greatest fears. And here's my reaction. That ain't happening.
You just clammed up.
And that's what I mean by the implosion.
Okay.
People who don't know each other are going to be very reluctant to open up and talk about their personal experiences, their fear, their emotions. Look, this is a group of people we don't know. I don't know them. My spouse doesn't know them. Never met them before. We've never had any time together. We've never shared a relationship. We're not friends. And we're not going to become friends, okay? You know what I wanted to know? What happens in an emergency during the delivery of my baby? That's what I want to know. I don't know what they want to know, and I don't really care because I'm not going to ever see them again. They're not part of my friendship circle. They're not people I'm going to go through this experience jointly together. I have no need to build relationship with these people. They come to the same class, they pay their money, they sign up to go through the class, and it's over. Nothing else. So there's no relationship, there's no time, there's no history together. And certainly we haven't had a traumatic event that we could share. And even if that's the only criteria, it's still, you don't do these things just because they have one criteria. You do these things because you got all 4 of those criteria. So that's the implosion. And that's what happened in that group. I mean, and I can tell you, everybody else in the group did the same thing. The guy sat there like this, just like me, okay? And the women just looked down and looked at everybody's shoes to make sure everybody's wearing shoes. Nobody was going to talk, and nobody did. It was a failed group. If that's what you wanted to achieve, is making friends out of it and a big support group, didn't happen at all. So what's the explosion? The explosion in heterogeneous groups comes because you have people who perceive that some in the group are getting more attention than I'm getting, and I don't like them getting that much attention, and they become resentful, angry, hostile, and sometimes they start attacking each other. That's a group explosion. None of those things are a good outcome when you're working with people. You do not need them imploding, and you do not need them especially exploding on each other because they feel like somebody's getting more attention than they're getting, and they're angry and upset and distressed by that. And boy, they don't even say that stuff. They just show it. Okay. So you really make a failure setup if you're going to take a diffusing or a critical incident stress debriefing and disregard those 4 criteria. Again, you've heard it before. You've heard it here first. Homogeneity of group needs to have a relationship, history, time, and exposure to the same traumatic event. And of course, they would have worked that event together because they are together as a group. They've already, that's pre-established before the event ever takes place. It's pre-established that they are a group. They don't get to be a group just because they've had some exposure to a traumatic event. Okay, if they've had an exposure to a traumatic event, they don't have the other criteria. Go back to CMB, which is crisis management briefing, and give them information only. And that is the safest way to go with people who just don't have all the criteria there.
Well, that's all really helpful information. And I certainly learned a lot today with regard to both, diffusings and debriefings, and how that applies into both the homogeneous and heterogeneous groups. So I appreciate you taking the time to go through all of that with us. Do you have any last minute advice for our viewers today on any of this information that we went over?
Yeah, I think if people have not had critical incident stress management training under an ICISF approved instructor, that they really need to get that if they plan to do this kind of work. If they've had it, then much of what I would have said could be a good review for them. And it might clarify some things where they maybe found a group didn't work so well for them when they were trying that, and they may have had a heterogeneous group instead of a homogenized group. So I think that in both counts, they might get something out of this, but I think if they haven't had the training, they should really pursue that training. We've been actually, because of the COVID situation, we've been put in a situation where we are now doing online critical incident stress management trainings, and never in my life would I have ever imagined doing anything like that, but it's what we're needing to do now. People have great needs for training, and we just can't ignore those needs. So we are doing some of those courses online now. So check the calendar for ICISF, and if you need the training, please get that. I hope if you're already on a team that you found maybe a couple of little insights that you didn't have before, or maybe a little different explanation than what you might have heard before about why homogeneity of group is so very important when you're doing diffusing or debriefing.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So if you've enjoyed our discussion today and would like to learn more about this information, you can actually register for one of ICISF's upcoming courses. Our core courses, Assisting Individuals in Crisis and Group Crisis Intervention, are currently coming up on February 10th through the 12th of 2021. These courses provide the foundation in critical incident stress management, or CISM, and are the courses that our staff recommend everyone begin with if they're just getting started. Now, if you've already taken our core courses, our Advanced Group Crisis Intervention course coming up on January 28th and 29th of 2021 is the course for you. If you're looking for the latest information on critical incident stress management techniques and post-trauma syndromes, this is definitely a course to register for. Our Advanced Group Crisis Intervention course builds on the knowledge base, which was obtained through the Group Crisis Intervention beginner course. To learn more about all of these courses that we talked about today, you can visit our website at icisf.org/remote-learning. The link is also in the description. We also have additional CISM resources, like our free open access quarterly journal, Crisis Stress and Human Resilience, which publishes peer-reviewed manuscripts on a variety of CISM topics. You can read articles at our website, crisisjournal.org, or click on the link in the description. We also have our new CISM bookstore, which offers a variety of CISM books. We have a special holiday countdown going on each Sunday this month on social media. To learn more, you can click on the link in the video description or visit CISMbookstore.com. Jeff, I did receive a quick question from one of our viewers.
Okay.
They would like to ask about the issue with homogenous groups, which meet all 4 criteria, but police refusing to meet with fire or vice versa.
Okay.
How should that be handled?
Generally speaking, unless you're living in a small community where everybody knows each other and they train together and practice together and, you know, they go on the same calls together. In that case, you really have 2 or 3 different homogenous groups. So they're homogenous within the police department, they're homogenous within the fire department, but that doesn't make them homogenous when you put the 2 together, because by taking 2 homogenous groups that don't have that same relationship with each other, they don't have that shared time and history with each other as much, then you end up putting them into the 2 homogenous groups become a heterogeneous group because they really don't know each other. So you're best off handling them in 2 separate processes. That is, you're going to deal with the fire personnel, diffusing, debriefing with them, and the police personnel, diffusing, debriefing with them. But I have seen also in some rural communities where they know each other very well. It's a small community. They've been working together for years. Police and fire are pretty much buddies, and they have a little different job or a big different job, but they do work together. In those cases, you might be able to put them together. There can be another exception when you have an event that is just way over the top and everybody's distressed. The fire is distressed, the police are distressed. You might end up putting them together in the same room. Now, that happened to me one time in an area where police usually do their thing and fire EMS does their thing, but we had a fire involving the very tragic death of 2 children who were literally burned up in a fire, and police attempted to make rescues, and eventually they were beaten back by the heat and the smoke, and so they had to give up on their efforts. And when the fire personnel got the children out, literally the children's bodies were burning with fire. So that was a really awful night, and police and fire were equally distressed over that tragic loss. And the fact that they had this incident just broke down a lot of the other boundaries that might take place with normal groups. So the police and fire in that particular situation ended up together because the nature of that event. I mean, here's police officers attempting to make a rescue and being beaten back by the flames. So the fire personnel understand that pretty well, and they just said, let's get everybody together on this thing. That's where it did work. So occasionally you're going to find an event is so horrific that even though they're not generally working together in an organization, they're not in the same organization, you might bring them together to actually do the critical incident stress debriefing because the event is so extreme. Okay. So that's a case where you might have an exception, but I can generally say this: it's an exception to the rule. It's not the rule. After that event occurred in my community, police went back to being police and fire went back to being fire, and they really didn't have one of these again for quite a long time, where you had the 2 groups combining together. And it was a number of years actually before we saw it happen again. And it was another horrific event involving children. And then they felt it was important to share each other's thoughts about that event together. And then we've had several years where we haven't seen it again for a long time. So that's what you're likely to see in that kind of a situation. So, you know, every once in a while you make an exception to the rule, but then it returns back to the rule again. And as I said, I've been doing this work for 48 years, And I've seen 3 or 4 of those things where we were able to take 2 different groupings, put them together, fire, rescue, and police together.
Mm-hmm.
And then they went back to where they were before. So just because you make an exception to the rule doesn't mean it becomes the rule.
Yeah, and the same person, one of our viewers, she also asked, what about union requesting only union to debrief them? Is there a situation where that needs to be honored?
Pretty much every time. If the union is saying, if they're not union people, we don't want them, that's what you have to put in there. You have to get union personnel in there, because mixing them with helpers who are non-union, you're going to get that explosion of the event. They will be resentful. They'll say, you guys don't know what we go through. You're not the same as us. Okay. So it is best not to be mixing them together. I would honor the request to use union only. Now, we've had a couple of occasions where police needed assistance right away in a law enforcement shooting, murder of a police officer, and police requested assistance from the fire service. Okay.
Okay.
So that's unusual, but when that does happen, then you honor that, because in fact, the fire personnel did a really great job handling that. When they sat down with the police officers, they said, we're not trained police officers, we're fire guys. We'll do the best we can to kind of help you with this thing, but we're not one of you. And they said, okay, but the incident of the murder of the police officer was so terrible, so catastrophic for everybody. I mean, the fire guys felt terrible. They had tried to save the guy. That didn't work. But the police department didn't have a team, and they begged for help from the fire service. So we've had police cross over and help fire. We've had fire cross over and help police. And because in many communities, it's fire and EMS together, but wherever the EMS is the third service, we've had police cross over to help them, or fire cross over to help them. So that's possible, but usually it's rare, extraordinary events that are really pretty overwhelming, where you see that crossover between one grouping and another. But when police come in and say, we're not here to investigate, we're here to help, and the emergency rescue teams, EMS and fire, they kind of go, okay, and they'll work with that. We've worked with military, and they've requested that we have military only. Well, if we have a bunch of people who are on the team who are former military service personnel, then that might work. But if we don't, we might have to people who don't have that background. So we've crossed over from civilian sector to military sector. We've had it happen when they had First Persian Gulf War. We pre-deployed everybody over to Germany and Europe and other parts of Europe. And then bad things happened over here, and their chaplains, their CISM people, they're overseas. So my team got called on a couple of those events to help out. We just made it clear that we respect and honor the military, but we're not military, and we'll try to do the best we can to help them out. And they were appreciative of that, and it did help. And they said so many times. But we had to use civilian CISM people to help the military, because everybody else had been pre-deployed overseas because of the war. So things happen like that, but you'll find again and again and again that after those experiences pass on, people go back to the way it was before, which is they prefer to have their own people working with them. Now, they don't have to be from that department. We can use fire with fire, and we can use police with police, and we can use EMS with EMS. So they don't have to be from the same department, but they do have to have had the same job in order to be effective as leadership on the team.
Well, and I guess that's also another reason why individuals should seek out to attend our core courses, so that way they can learn the foundation for CISM as well, and the importance behind that. So
the same rationale applies to police as it does to fire, as it does to EMS, that the criteria is the same between those different groups. So when you're dealing with a fire debriefing, you need to have the same homogenized group criteria that you have if you're working with a police unit. So between those, that kind of stuff works very nicely. It's just that when you're working in communities where they work together, you have to really be careful to make decisions based on a rational approach. Okay. In other words, there's no absolute things. I'm going to say it's absolute. Don't use a diffusing or debriefing when you have a heterogeneous group. That's an absolute. But I can say that there are no absolutes in these crossovers between one organization or agency and another, but you have to be careful to make them clear as an exception to the usual rule. But rules have been developed for a reason, and the reason is that they help to assure that the diffusing or the critical incident stress debriefing are going to run effectively and are going to have the best benefit, not a questionable outcome, not a negative outcome for sure. So you want to make sure that we have the best possible outcome, and it's by following these basic rules that we get that.
Well, Dr. Mitchell, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and for our new CISM Live series. And if any of our viewers would like to join us for the next one, be sure to just subscribe to ICISF's YouTube channel so that way you don't miss out on upcoming events. And from all of us at ICISF, we just want to wish you all a very happy holiday season and a healthy and joyous new year. Thank you all so much for joining us today and participating, and we'll see you next time.
And stay healthy, and hopefully one day when COVID is gone into history, we'll be meeting personally somewhere. So thank you.